The last month of everyone's lives has been filled with anticipation, all pointing to one specific day to celebrate, and that day is finally here. Yes, everyone, I'm talking about Christmas, and more specifically, in this video, I'm going to be talking about the evolution of Santa Claus, how he went from a Greek bishop dressed in his long bishop's robes into the jolly red fat man that we know today. And along the way, hopefully we can learn some stuff about how people celebrate and how we hold up and create these symbols that we use to represent specific aspects of life. And maybe we'll be able to discover where Santa's future is headed. And if that's good with you, class is in session and we're going to get into it. So most everybody knows that Santa Claus is based off of a real life person named Saint Nicholas, but people don't really know any of the history about him. So I'm going to start with that. And a quick note before we do get into it. There's a lot of non-verifiable history with him. The man was born in the late 200s AD, and most of the history about him was written several centuries later. So this isn't what we would call a historically verifiable account, but this is the generally accepted and popular understanding of his origin. So with that out of the way, let's turn back the clock to about 270 AD. This is roughly the time period that it's accepted that St. Nicholas was born, and he was born in a small town called Patara. It was a seaport in what is now modern-day Turkey, but back then it was just called Asia Minor. According to tradition, he was born to very wealthy Greek parents that were living in Asia Minor at the time. And we don't really know anything about his young life growing up. The next real account that we get of him is that at some point when he was a young man, both of his parents died from some disease that was in the area, so he inherits all of their wealth. You'd think he would go out and spend all this money and buy all these lavish things, especially back then. Life was fairly difficult. So it would stand to reason that he would use that money to be well off and spend it on whatever he wanted. But he actually does the exact opposite. He goes out and sells pretty much all of his stuff. And it's attributed to the story of the rich young ruler in the Bible, where, if you're not familiar, this young man comes up to Jesus and asks him how he gets into heaven. And Jesus tells him to obey the law and follow all the rules established by the Old Testament. And the rich young ruler says, yeah, I did all that. What else? And Jesus tells him, go sell your things and give it to the poor. And the rich young ruler just kind of goes away disheveled. It's pretty widely accepted that he did not, in fact, do that. And St. Nicholas, being inspired by this story, to not go away disheveled like the rich young ruler, decides to sell his things and give it away, and that's what he does. The major story that comes out of this point in Nicholas's life is a story where there's this man in the city that he's living in who has 3 daughters that he wants to get married, but for whatever reason, he can't afford to pay their dowry in order to marry them off. And if you're not familiar, a dowry is basically a payment from one or both parties in a marriage that acts both as a show of wealth, but also a sort of insurance policy. At this point, dowries were often paid to guarantee from the father of the bride that the groom was going to take care of her, that he was going to protect her, and in some cases that he would be loyal to her. And this guy has no money to afford to do that, and he's worried that this is going to cause his children to fall into prostitution, which was a very common thing for unmarried women in the day. So Nicholas, being the guy who's currently going around town giving away all of his money, decides to help this guy out, but he doesn't do it in the way of just showing up to the dude's house and giving him money. He decides to be a little more sneaky about it because he doesn't want this guy to feel embarrassed that he doesn't have the money to pay this dowry. So Nicholas devises a plan where he takes gold coins and puts them in a bag and then throws them through the window of this guy's house in the middle of the night. So he does this the first time. The guy takes the money, pays the dowry for his first daughter. She gets married, and there's a celebration. A couple days later, the same thing happens. A sack of gold coins comes through the window in the middle of the night. The guy takes it, pays the dowry for his second daughter. There's a wedding celebration. Everybody's happy. And now this guy has kind of caught on and wants to find out where this is coming from. Why is this happening? So he decides he's going to stay up all night and wait and try to find who's doing this. So he waits and he waits and he waits, and pretty soon morning comes, nothing's happened. But that doesn't stop him. He waits up all night the second night, and he waits and he waits and he waits, and nothing happens, and then it's morning. Finally, on the third night, he's waiting and he's waiting, and suddenly the sack of gold coins comes through the window, and he catches Nicholas and he confronts him, saying how excited and how happy he is that this man is doing this and how thankful he is. And Nicholas tells him not to tell anybody. He says, don't let anybody know that I was here. Nobody needs to know where you got the money or that you never even had the money. Again, even in being gracious to these people, Nicholas is telling them, don't out yourself. Save face. Don't let people know that you couldn't afford this, which is a pretty interesting move. I feel like we don't often see people giving money away to charities or organizations without being really pompous about it. They share it. It's a common thing in like advertisements for companies that, you know, they give so much money to X organization, or they spent this much money on sustainability, just trying to get people's attention over it. And here this guy is giving away his personal wealth, and he doesn't want anybody to know. This is also possibly inspired by another story that Jesus tells, where he says, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, which is basically to say when you give something away, you don't do it for others. You don't do it to be seen. And God, who's watching you, will see that you've done that in secret, and he will reward you later. This could have been another thing that inspired him to act this way towards this man. Or he could also be reflecting Jesus, who, after healing several people on several different occasions, also told them not to tell anybody. And there's another story from around this time that'll be really important later. He was traveling to the Holy Land on a ship. The ship gets caught in a storm, and all of the sailors think that they're about to die. He goes out on deck and he prays over the storm, and it stops. And it's for this that later on he would become the patron saint of sailors. After his stint in the Holy Land, he returns to the region that he's from, and he becomes the bishop of a town called Myra. There's a couple different stories about how he becomes bishop. One of them is really funny. It basically goes that the old bishop died at this church, and all of the leaders said, okay, whoever the first person is to walk through our church doors, that's going to be our bishop. And he just so happened to be the one who walked in. So anyway, he becomes a bishop in the church. He very shortly after becoming bishop would actually get arrested and be tortured by the Roman government, who under the Emperor Diocletian had put out a decree that churches and places of worship were to be burned, and they would go out and capture Christian believers and worshipers and either torture them or on several occasions put them to death. And it's because of this he spends the next 3 to 4 years in prison until he's released in 306 AD under the new emperor, Constantine. From there, his story goes dark for a little while until about 325 AD, where he is recorded as being one of the members who attended the Council of Nicaea. If you don't know, the Council of Nicaea was a collection of bishops in the early Christian church who were brought together to talk about doctrinal issues that the church was facing. And the big one that was tackled at Nicaea was this heresy called Arianism. Basically says that rather than Jesus being part of the Trinity, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, he was actually created by God rather than being God himself. And this was a pretty widespread thing that the bishops really wanted to tackle. They did, as according to a lot of traditions, Nicholas becomes so upset when talking with these people and the people who are defending this heresy that he actually gets up and slaps one of them. Some traditions say it was Arius himself, the guy who originated the heresy. And it's for this that he gets arrested. He's not allowed to participate in the rest of the council, but then he's later let out of jail, One of the other stories that I wanted to touch on with the actual Saint Nicholas is there's a story that the area where he was living had a very big famine that swept through. And the story goes that there was this evil butcher who took 3 children, cut them up, and pickled them in order to sell them to starving people. Nicholas either finds out about this or he sees it, and he prays over, and the kids are resurrected and come back to life. And it's because of this he gets his other sainthood, being the patron saint of children. It also leads to some really very weird medieval art. Do with that what you will. And from there, there's not really a whole lot to get into. He continues to be a bishop and do the work that his church has for him. Estimated that he died on or around December 6th of 346 AD, which would become the eventual date of his feast after he was canonized into sainthood in 1446. It is from this sainthood and the celebrations of his feast day, December 6th, that we would start to get more and more of the traditions that we start to see today, being as it was on December 6th and fairly close to Christmas. The celebrations of St. Nicholas as this kind of bringer of the Christmas season, kind of this preemptive figure for Christmas. You know, we have the celebration of St. Nicholas on our way to Christmas. So it's like this building anticipation up to the big celebration. It starts to get mixed into where St. Nicholas is just celebrated on or around Christmas time. And there are tons of different celebrations and cultural or regional things that kind of surround Santa Claus. Different cultures have these different traditions. One of the most famous is the Alpine regions in Europe. They have traditions where they mix Santa Claus in with Krampus, where Santa Claus is the bringer of good gifts, and then Krampus is kind of this deliverer of punishment. And to me, I don't know that this is actually how this came about. Krampus's history is kind of just as complicated as Santa Claus's, but to me it seems almost like, and again this is something that's pretty common that we see in a lot of Christian traditions, where they will mix with the pagan traditions that already existed. Krampus to me feels almost like a cryptid in a way. He's this evil entity that lives out in the woods. His goal is to teach children not to go too far from the village, or else the Krampus is going to get you. And then when it gets mixed in with Santa Claus, it's like you have the Christian traditions that come down from St. Nicholas, and you have the pagan traditions in Krampus, and they kind of mix together to where if you follow the pagan traditions, you're just going to get pain and suffering. But if you do like Santa Claus and you follow these Christian traditions, you'll be rewarded. Just kind of this way of the two intermingling together in a way that I think is really cool. Again, I don't know if that's historically accurate or not, just a thought that I had. One of the main Christmas traditions that would come over to America would actually be passed down from the Dutch. Remember how I said St. Nicholas is the patron saint of sailors? Well, the Dutch have maybe one of the richest sailing traditions in the world. So their celebrations of basically their saint are a really big deal. They get brought over to the US as the Dutch kind of migrate there, and it becomes such a prominent thing that there's actually newspapers and books and these articles being written about the culture at the time. And one of these works was a satirical work by a guy by the name of Washington Irving, who wrote this book, The History of New York, in 1809. And it's like a parody of the Dutch culture that existed. And there's a big section on it of Santa Claus. And the way he describes him is not like the thin bishop in the robes and the hat. He describes Santa Claus like a portly Dutch sailor. He's got the big belly and this wintered coat, and he smokes a pipe, and he's just jolly. This kind of starts to stick. And rather than taking this parody and being like offended by it, they pretty much embrace it. And this becomes kind of the footprint of what American Santa Claus grows from. This is the foundational start of how we get to Santa that we have today. I also want to touch on one of the traditions that the Dutch brought to the US is a tradition called wassailing. It's the tradition where we get caroling from, actually. The tradition was that people would dress up in different costumes, either as elves or like Santa Claus, and they would show up to your house and sing or play songs for you. And the whole point of that was, oh, okay, so somebody comes and wassails, you give them a gift, like giving cocoa to carolers now. And one of the reasons that Irving wrote his book was to like kind of temper down the celebrations that had been happening. The celebrations that were happening at the time basically turned into like drunken frat parties. Wassailing basically became like a glorified house raid where people would just show up, break into your house, play music and sing, and then steal from you. I just think it's funny that in order to calm that down, he just wrote a book about how Santa was a fat Dutch sailor. Apparently it worked. It's from this initial description of Santa that things really start to evolve. Throughout the 1800s, the idea of Mrs. Claus and the workshop and him being like the inventor of toys, all of that really starts to come about in the 1800s through like poems and newspaper articles, and then it just continues on. It's around this time that you also start to have the Salvation Army dressing their volunteers up around Christmas time as Santa Claus, as a way to, again, kind of hold to the tradition of generosity and giving to other people, while also spreading the prominence of Santa Claus as this Christmas figure. In the 1920s, it's the Roaring 20s. Economic prosperity starts to take off in the United States, and it's at this point that several like drink corporations start to use Santa in their advertising. And once we get into the 30s, Coca-Cola jumps on that bandwagon. From there, he just kind of skyrockets as a kind of Christmas icon. You get into the 40s during the war, Santa's used to like sell war bonds and encourage people to support the war effort in Europe. Once we move on past the war effort, we get the Santa of like the 60s and 70s, where he's kind of introduced into popular music, and we really start to see like recordings of so many of the like famous Christmas songs about Santa really start to come up around this time, as music's really taken off as just a cultural export of the US. Once we get into the 80s, we start to see kind of this commercialization of Santa Claus. The 80s are, again, this other time of economic prosperity, and America just starts to ramp up into kind of the consumerist state that we've kind of turned into now. The 80s, you start to see shopping malls all over the nation. Well, what's in those shopping malls? A Santa Claus. As soon as we had a shopping mall, we put a Santa in it. What's in the stores? Santa. What's on the shelves? Santa decorations, Santa mugs, just branded Santa stuff everywhere. That's where this really starts to take off. It kind of starts to evolve with the technology and the culture. It's not just that the culture changes and he's, maybe catching up. It's pretty much he's right there at the center. As you move into the 90s and the 2000s, you start to see him more prominent in evolving technology. Social media comes around and you have, it's a Santa Claus Facebook account. You can send him a Facebook message rather than sending him a letter. When I was growing up, there was a Santa video game, which it was just a bowling game with like a Santa skin on it. And one of the things that I remember was if you got it just right to the far side, you put your cursor just far enough to the right side, the ball would actually skip and hit a reindeer that was standing on the side of the game. Santa continues to grow with the technology. You get the 2010s where he starts to be pushed more and more into this kind of technological space. Again, the social media stuff, digital advertising. You start to have ads around Christmas time where Santa has an iPhone. You start to see more of the mechanization of how Santa would actually get stuff done in the modern day. He doesn't have a sleigh powered by reindeer. His sleigh is jet powered instead. You start to see things like that. He's advertising for like Mercedes. That starts around then. We move into the 2020s. Now we have the Zoom call Santa. Now, rather than somebody going in to wait in line at a mall, now you can just get on a Zoom call and talk to Santa. Now he's used to advertise more like social issues. You have like different races of Santas, Santa that's in a wheelchair, Santa's used to push like environmental things, Santa used as a protest for coal, more green earth stuff. In the last couple years, I've kind of just seen him sort of go away. Like the imagery of him is still kind of around, like the colors, everything's red and white around Christmas and it's wrapped in a bow, but Santa himself seems to be kind of going away. I don't have kids, but friends and people that I know that have kids say that the schools that their kids go to don't do Christmas party anymore. That was one of the things I remember growing up. We're going to take a day in school to have a Christmas party, or when you were really young, you'd write a letter to Santa in school. That's just not a thing anymore. And I don't know if it's just, oh, we're just moving away from Santa, or if it's that they don't want anything that has to do with any Christian background. It's like this weird thing about Christmas movies that I've noticed. Like, remind me if I'm wrong, but like when I was growing up, Christmas movies were all about like reconnecting with family or being generous to other people. A lot of the things that Santa had come to symbolize. And now it just seems kind of mean-spirited, or Santa's completely gone. I don't know if I should blame Hallmark for that and the fact that they just have Christmas movies that don't really have anything to do with Santa or any like magical thing, or if there's something like a little more cynical. Just off the top of my head, I've seen 3 Christmas movies this year. Red One, which is not about Santa. It's about his head security elf. Santa's like hardly in the movie. Dear Santa with Jack Black, where instead of Santa, he plays Satan. The whole crux of the movie is this kid is going to learn some things from Satan, or Satan's going to take him out and they're going to do all this celebratory, like hedonistic stuff, all the stuff that the kid's going to really love. And it's like, yeah, Satan's really fun. But then at the end, I'm sure it's going to be, oh, well, he was just misunderstood, or this kid's actually going to teach Satan something, which is like, what? How have we gone from celebrating Santa and everything that he kind of came from, his Christian roots, to now the exact opposite in a Christmas movie? There was one other Christmas movie that my in-laws watched with Lindsay Lohan on Netflix, and the entire movie, I'm just sitting there wondering when one of these people is gonna like have a change of heart and actually be a good person, and it like never happens. The entire movie is about getting high in church and tons of like cheating on spouses. I think there's like 4 affairs in that movie, and like nobody learns their lesson. Everybody kind of gets what they want. Nobody really changes. I don't mean to make this a rant about that movie. It's just, it just seems mean-spirited, and like that spirit of Christmas that we kind of used to strive for in our movies and in like personal lives is kind of gone. And I don't really know what to do about it. You know, I've seen things around that Santa's just become this symbol of capitalism, and he doesn't actually mean anything. People just use Santa to sell you products, which, I mean, maybe, but also like, why use Santa as a way to market a product when like the main buying demographic is 18 to 35? Why would you market to them with Santa when, according to a very depressing Google search, most people stop believing in Santa at 8. So is it just like they just want you to be nostalgic? What's the reason that we just continue to have Santa around? Is it, I mean, with some of these movies, it's like, well, we don't really have Santa around. And that's the most depressing thing to me is this just going to be another one of those traditions that we kind of let go? It's been 700-ish years since he became a saint. Are we just giving up? Are we just done with Santa? It's just a depressing thought. But I like to be a hopeful pessimist, and I like to think that we're not done with Santa, that celebrations of him will continue. You know, we now have this movement back towards the old traditions that we used to have. Some of them are really good, some of them not so good. I wonder if because of this, we'll start going back to Santa and the things that he used to stand for. Seeing the holiday that is so important to so many people just become this holiday where everybody's greedy and angry, and we have to get in fights about whether you say Merry Christmas or Happy Holidays. And like, we can't push past these weird roadblocks that we've put up. Like, I feel like Christmas when I was growing up was very put aside your differences to come together and celebrate something that's outside yourself, that's bigger than you. And now it just feels like, well, we don't celebrate anything bigger than us. Like, we're the center of the holiday. It's what we can get and what gifts we can buy, maybe even not for anybody that we know, but just for ourselves. And that gets me to like the main point that kind of started the whole thought of this video was, why is Santa so far removed from where he started? This slow progression into obscurity where only a select few people will actually celebrate Santa? Or is it that we've just given up on the ideals that he used to be? Now he's just this fun, loving kind of spirit that comes around. And I think that's where so many of the issues that people have with Santa, you know, people say that he's this symbol of capitalism. It's like, okay, well, that's because he no longer represents the ideals. We took him away from the thing that made him so popular in the first place. And because we have moved away from that thing that made him so popular, which is the celebration of the Christian tradition of Christ being born on Christmas. That was the whole point of Santa being kind of this preemptive celebration, pointing us towards Christmas and towards the birth of Jesus. Now that we no longer celebrate the birth of Jesus, at least on a broad cultural sense, we don't celebrate Santa either. If you're like me and kind of feel like all the holiday stuff that you're supposed to feel around this season, the holiday cheer and the goodwill towards men, if you kind of feel that that's missing in the world, and especially in yourself, my encouragement would be to, whether you're Christian or not, don't care, I still think this would be a good idea. Take a friend or a family member or a group of you and just go to a Christmas service. Doesn't matter if you belong to the church or not, just go, because you might be surprised. You might find the ideals that Santa represented in that church, because that's where they originated. Again, I'm not expecting any conversions out of this. I still think if you're hungry for those ideals and you want to see those things out in the world, well, you should probably start and understand where they came from so that you can then take them out into the world yourself. And maybe, just maybe, while you're in that church service, you may be able to rediscover some of that childhood wonder that Santa used to bring. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit about the history of Santa Claus, this kind of figure that everybody knows of, but maybe we don't know the history of. I hope you all have a very good holiday season. I know that this time can be really difficult for some people. A lot of people have like traumas that are based around the holiday season. And although I don't really know what that's like, I imagine it's more difficult than just somebody who has a problem with one particular day, because we start celebrating Christmas at the 1st of November. I imagine being surrounded by all of this stuff that reminds you of that is not easy when it goes on for nearly 2 months. So if you know somebody who really struggles around this time of year, reach out to them, especially if you're like a trusted friend or family member. I don't think anybody deserves to be lonely or sad or depressed on Christmas. The whole point is that it's supposed to be a joyous time, but not everybody feels that, and that's a real shame. And, you know, you might be one of those people who can really bring that to somebody else's life. And if you are somebody who struggles around this time of year, please reach out to a trusted friend or family member. If you don't have one of those, reach out to somebody on the internet, whether that is a friend or a stranger. I know it's the internet, but there are some like genuinely good people who just want to help one another. Even if it is just in the digital space. I just don't want people to be sad or really struggle with this time of year, because it's something that really brings me a lot of joy, even if I don't really participate in a lot of the kind of secular Santa stuff. I focus more on the foundation of my faith around this time of year. I would just encourage you to help spread those ideals that Santa had, even if you aren't a believer, because maybe that's one of the things that can help us kind of rediscover the Christmas spirit and what it was supposed to be like when we just started celebrating it. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video. Merry Christmas, God bless you, and class dismissed.